There's a growing body of evidence that shows that economic policies can have very long-run effects, and in particular, that colonial policies continue to affect economic outcomes in developing countries today. And my job market paper asks the question of why. So why are these policies so persistent, and why were inefficient policies not reversed in the post-colonial period? And I do this in the context of a unique historical industry, the production of opium by the British in colonial India. From the late 18th century till the early 20th century, the British produced very significant amounts of opium in India for export to China. This has accounted for a major share of colonial revenue and a very significant share of India's exports. And using a difference in discontinuity design and data that I collected on public good provision in the colonial period, I showed that it actually distorted public spending at the local level. Opium growing areas received more investments in irrigation, which was an important input to production, and in the police, which was used to control the government's monopoly and crack down on smuggling. But conversely, there was less spending on the wider economy, in particular on human capital. So fewer schools constructed in opium-growing areas, and less spending on education and healthcare per capita. And then what I'm able to do is to fast forward 1 century after the end of the opium trade and see how persistent these different policies were. And what I find is that there are no significant persistent differences in terms of irrigation or the police, because new investments were made over time that led to convergence. But conversely, for human capital, effects are highly persistent. So today, opium-growing areas have fewer schools, fewer health centers, and lower literacy. What differentiates my paper from the existing literature is not only that I can look at the relative persistence of different policies in the same context, but also that I can look at some of the mechanisms that could explain this pattern of persistence. And I look at 4 separate mechanisms in the paper, but the one that is most consistent with the data relates to the political equilibrium. In any colonial context, you could imagine that the allocation of resources could be inefficient from the perspective of the local population. But then the question is why, when the colonial power leaves, these policies are not reversed, in particular in a democratic setting. And what I find in the context of this region is that in every election for which I have data, there's significantly lower turnout in opium-growing areas, and in the modern period, where I can also look at the kind of politicians that these areas cast votes for, I find that they cast more votes for politicians who face criminal charges. And if you combine this with other literature that has shown that precisely these politicians provide fewer public goods in India, then you can see that these areas could be stuck in a negative equilibrium. Public good provision is lower, and the political mechanism that could potentially help to alleviate this works less well than elsewhere.